Hi, everyone. This is Professor Hai Nguyen, and I want to welcome you back into the second half of my week's lecture, focusing on, once again, looking at African Americans and their quest to fulfill the promises that were made to them during the Reconstruction era under the 14th Amendment and under the 15th Amendment as well. The last time we left off, we looked at somewhat the origins of the urban riots, looking at white flight, movement to the suburbs, and how it impacted African Americans in the inner cities. And we left off looking at the Watts riot in 1965, really as a somewhat endpoint in the first half of the lecture. And that's where ultimately I want to pick up here, guys. Okay. Because it's not just going to be just the city of Watts that is going to burn up in flames. This was a very common, somewhat experience and theme that African Americans live under across other major American cities as well. And this is going to be a repeating pattern, especially after 1965, all the way up until 1968. It's simply because, again, Martin Luther King describes the inner cities where African Americans were living as a powder keg, right? It was a powder keg. And he describes it as African Americans are frustrated because they were living in this airtight cage of poverty. Is that something we forget, that Martin Luther King was really somewhat changing his tune, was that 1964 somewhat represents the apex of his argument of nonviolence and civil disobedience, if you will, using Christianity as a way to fight for equality. But even Martin Luther King himself is going to have somewhat a awakening, in a sense, is that once he moves his struggle and his focus outside of the South, when he goes into places like Chicago and when he goes into somewhat the North, what he comes to find out is that it's much, much, much harder to fight for jobs, housing, education than it was to somewhat fight against segregation. Because again, guys, the question that I keep referring to is ultimately, how do you somewhat encourage and how do you somewhat pressure and ultimately force white businesses, white private-owned businesses to hire blacks, right? When historically, white America's perception of African Americans have always been in a negative, somewhat dangerous and threatening perception, if you will. So how do you do that? Because at the end of the day, guys, let's just call it for what it is. In all workplaces, and even the residence that we live in, the neighborhood that we live in, we all want to live with somewhat similar-minded people, right? It's always the saying, like, somebody I would somewhat want to go have a beer with. Right? And oftentimes, guys, unfortunately, the person that you often want to go have a beer with is often somebody that has a very similar experience to you, or somebody that is racially similar to you. Let's just call it for what it is, guys. So you might want to just take a survey of your closest friends and figure out how diverse are your friends. Because at the end of the day, even I myself, guys, I am somewhat guilty of it, because I will tell you right now, majority of my friends, yes, sadly, or I don't know, whatever it is, are Asian Americans, right? Because I think it's just maybe human nature. We tend to somewhat relate and somewhat keep our closest inner circles to somewhat people that we look alike the most, or maybe that's just how we were raised, right? So yes, it's a very sad story how that somewhat becomes a scenario, if you will. And this is where ultimately I want to continue, is that, again, African Americans trapped in this airtight cage of poverty. They can't move to the suburbs, right? I already talked about the various methods, right, that African Americans have tried previously. Moving, joining the military, right? Voting, boycotting, protesting. It all had its limits, okay? Is that by the 1960s, right, the only thing that African Americans could still hold on to is that they still had their leaders, right? They still had Martin Luther King. They still have somewhat Malcolm X, right, to look up to as a way of somewhat leading them to the promised land. But guys, oh my goodness. Yes. Oh, this is going to be a very somewhat bad moment that we have, because the very leaders that African Americans had placed their hopes in, guys, 1965, if I'm not mistaken, Malcolm X gets assassinated. Okay, in 1968, it is Martin Luther King that loses life to a bullet. And as a result, the very leaders that African Americans were holding their hopes to, right, were assassinated. Okay, even white politicians that they had placed their hopes in, Robert Kennedy, this was the brother of John F. Kennedy, he gets shot too. It just seems like every time African Americans find somebody that they believe could somewhat fight on their behalf, it just seems like that person lose their life to somewhat at the end of a bullet. So the question becomes, what are African Americans supposed to do now, right? And that's what I want you to think about, is that what other alternative is there left for African Americans to use? And that's part of the reason why, right, you have a splintering in the African American civil rights movement, is that I'm going to share with you another clip from the Eyes on the Prize documentary series, looking at somewhat the tension that already existed between the older generation activists and the more younger, right? These are the college students. So folks in SNCC and CORE, Stokely Carmichael. I'm going to share with you a clip. It's in Lowndes County, Mississippi, if I'm not mistaken, right? This is where you have the rise of what we call Black Power. Because why? The young African-American activists, they are sick and tired at the slow change of, the slow rate of change, right? That even though you have the Civil Rights Bill, you have the Voting Rights Act, African-Americans were still poor, were still segregated, were still not able to vote. And as a result, guys, there's only so many times you can get arrested, get your chest shot in with a gas canister and walk away and do the same thing all over again, right? Maybe going to jail the first time with your homies and somewhat your crew might be fun when you're hanging out in somewhat jail and you're singing songs, but that gets very old after the 10th time, the 20th time, or for the 100th time, as many of the activists will do. But at least we celebrate somewhat their courage and their contribution. But guys, I hope that you take the time to watch somewhat the short documentary that I'm assigning to you. I even assigned to you the minute mark that you should watch. I'm not expecting you to watch the whole entire thing. Each segment should be only about 20 minutes, right? So 20 minutes for the rise of Black Power. It really highlights the tension between the younger activists, SNCC, CORE, Stokely Carmichael, and folks like Martin Luther King, who still wanted to somewhat maintain the peace, still wanted to somewhat integrate, sing Kumbaya, and hold each other's hands. Okay, and then I'm also assigning to you a short little clip on the origins of the Detroit riot, another 20-minute clip to really highlight to you what happened in the city of Detroit in 1967 that ultimately is going to force the Kerner Commission and LBJ to conclude that despite all of the progress and all of the laws that they had passed, the Civil Rights Bill, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that by 1968, it was still quite clear that America was still divided, one Black, one white, unequal. So despite the laws that were passed, there was still really no progress that could be shown. And why 1968 matters is simply because by 1968, guys, that is where you have the backlash, okay? That is where you have the backlash, because why? You have Southern Democrats leaving the Democratic Party because they are frustrated that the Democratic Party, Lyndon Baines Johnson, had passed the Civil Rights Bill, ultimately abolishing segregation in the South. And as a result, this is where Southern Democrats are going to switch their allegiance. they are going to commit themselves to the Republican Party. So anybody tell you today that the Republican Party is somehow pro-Black and they care about Black people, they're not taking into the consideration that there was a somewhat racist element of the Democratic Party that ultimately decided to switch and infuse itself into somewhat the Republican Party. And that's going to be the reason why, guys, we call Richard Nixon the Southern strategy, because by 1968, Richard Nixon resurrected from the dead, because Richard Nixon had ran for the presidency in 1960, okay? But he lost to JFK simply because he didn't know that television made him look really bad. He was just sweating a lot in terms of these television debates, if you will. But by 1968, like Jesus, guys, politically, Richard Nixon is resurrected from the dead, right? He becomes a serious nominee of the Republican Party, and Richard Nixon is going to build an alliance, right? Working class people in the North, but he's also going to try to bring in the fold of those Southern Democrats, right, in the South as part of the Republican Party. And as a result, guys, the second redemption, right? The second redemption against the rise of Black power from white America begins in 1968. Richard Nixon campaigns on a platform of law and order, because what he was witnessing was that American cities, starting in 1965 up until 1968, you have Watts, you have Newark, you have Detroit, you have Baltimore, burning up in flames every single summer. And even though African Americans are frustrated, they're marching out the street, demanding for their government to fulfill the promises that were made to them, right, of equality, equal protection, and equal access. Unfortunately, guys, by 1968, Richard Nixon, right, he doesn't care about any of that. He wants to put everything back to what it used to be. So this thing we call, it's a dog whistle language. Dog whistle mean, I don't know if you guys own a dog or anything. You blow a whistle, even though you can't hear it, right? The dog can. And the dog in this metaphor, it's basically the silent majority of white Americans who were angry and frustrated that African Americans were demanding for handouts, that you have African Americans marching in the street, right, protesting against their government. And then on top of that, you have the Vietnam War. It seems like America was losing to the communists. So you have this coalition of working class, racist Southerners, white Americans in the suburbs, all coming together, voting for Richard Nixon. And as a result, the reaction, backlash from the silent majority begins in 1968. That is why, guys, if you look at it, the pendulum sort of swing, because you have Richard Nixon, right, 1970s, and then you have Gerald Ford, who was also a Republican. We took a little break with Jimmy Carter in the late 1970s, but if you look at it, Nixon, Ford, you have Reagan for 2 terms, then you have Bush, right, for 1 term, took a little break with Bill Clinton, and then you have somewhat George Bush, his son, for 2 more terms, right? And as a result, you can see that from 1968, the Republican regained somewhat control of the White House, the balance of power in the federal government, simply because they were exploiting that resentment, that hatred, that backlash from white America towards Black America, right? And as a result, that is the reason why you are going to have a string of Republican somewhat presidents starting from 1968 all the way up until the present day, if you will. Donald Trump is really an extension. And we'll see how 2020 go, guys, because we may be on the verge of what I call, or what historians are calling, the third redemption. Because why? Donald Trump is a backlash against Barack Obama. Because again, in history, guys, it's a repetitive cycle, right? Anytime when you have the rise of Black power, there comes a white backlash, if you will. And again, I'm offering you evidence. You can argue me with that I'm wrong, but I'm hoping that you bring more than just simply, well, telling me that I'm wrong. I'm hoping that you can use history as a guiding tool, if you will. So if you look at it, with their leaders dead, Malcolm X is dead, Martin Luther King dead, you have a splintering of the civil rights movement after 1968 that Stokely Carmichael, he's this young gung-ho activist, right? But he's talking about Black power. And what Black power means is for African Americans to take control of their movement and lead their own movement and shape their demands. So you have this link between the struggle in America with what was happening in Africa, but it gets really chaotic after 1968. African Americans can't seem to coalesce around a single, somewhat individual or a single leader to somewhat lead them in their fight for equality. But there's also resentment. It's a higher hill that they have to climb, guys, because why white America simply was opposing the demands of African Americans. And the Republican mantra is really simple: smaller government. That is it. That you have Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, right, really imposing this idea that it's not the government that is the solution, but it is the government that is the somewhat the cause of the problem. It is creating a culture of dependency. So I like to call it the origins of Fox News, right? Because that's the argument of conservatives today, is that instead of recognizing that African Americans are simply demanding for the same thing that white America had received historically, now you have people today making the argument that African Americans are whiners, African Americans are asking for extra handouts, that food stamp, welfare, social services are not really somewhat helping these people, but it's really somewhat creating a culture of dependency, right? It's not motivating them to go to work. Symbolically, the idea of a welfare queen, okay? So I'm also gonna send you an additional link, but it's up to you if you wanna check it out or not. A podcast, it's called The Queen. So they look at the history of how the Republican Party, especially Ronald Reagan, using the idea of African-American women as somewhat moochers and welfare queen, and as a way to somewhat create resentment, right? And intensify the hate and the resentment that somewhat is boiling in white America in particular. So I will send that link down below for you to check out. It's a really short series. I think it's only like 4 episodes. So you're interested in the concept and the origins of the welfare queen itself, I highly recommend it. It was created by Slate, if I'm not mistaken. So you can check it out for free, because right now, let's face it, guys, I mean, it's not like we got anything else to do, right? Other than consume content, if you will. So 1968 is the beginning of the backlash that you have. And again, it's a very same feeling that African Americans have, because the moment where they feel like they have achieved some kind of progress, okay, it just seems like America pushes them back 2 steps, okay? And what I mean by that is that if you look at it, African Americans had heightened expectations. Because why? The Civil Rights Bill had passed, the Voting Rights Act bill has passed. So as a result, they think that things are going to be better. And what you have is, even into the 1970s, what you have is, I will give credit where credit is due, Richard Nixon was responsible for this program we call affirmative action, okay? So affirmative action was a program by the US government to ultimately give preference, or at least to carve out a certain amount of positions for people of color in educational institutions and also from government agencies, to allow African Americans to somewhat catch up to white America. But the problem that you have is that affirmative action is going to be somewhat criticized by the 1980s. And ultimately really weakened. It's because, again, Ronald Reagan, when he comes into office, he has this mantra that the government is not the solution, but it's really the problem. So it's greatly weakened. And then on top of that, they're going to try to do this thing, it's called busing. So what ends up happening is you're going to have local school districts, right, transporting Black kids from the inner cities taking them to school in the suburbs and vice versa. They're going to take white kids from the suburbs and they're going to bus them to the inner city. So that way you are somewhat integrating society together. But the problem is, once again, right? Parents are not happy with that solution because you have white parents making an argument, why the hell do my kids got to travel miles just to go to school when there is a school right down the street? And then on top of that, it comes down to somewhat who is in charge of education. Is it the federal government? Is it the local government? And also, it's about parents' rights and freedom as well, right? As a parent, you want to be able to have the freedom to send your kids to the school that you wish, right? So it gets really complicated in terms of this idea of affirmative action and busing as a tool to somewhat integrate society. And both measures will somewhat face criticism from white America because, again, white Americans feel that affirmative action is reverse discrimination and busing programs were somewhat a violation of their right as parents. So it gets really somewhat messy. So making a long story short, even the advancement that you have, that African Americans achieve, it is being under attack. And to make things even worse, guys, it doesn't get better. By the 1980s, what you have is, once again, you have a repeat of the same old cycle, okay? By the 1980s, the economy somewhat contracts. There's a recession. So that means that people were losing their jobs. And anytime when the economy contracts, of course, it's people of color, it's minorities, African Americans who are the hardest hit, okay? And it's very similar to what happened, guys. This is what I mean when I say history repeats itself, because again, LA had already experienced this in 1965 with the Watts riot. And what you have is, once again, the same conditions. By the 1980s, in LA, similar story. You have jobs moving away, except this time they're going overseas, okay? Because China is going to open up its economy. Western manufacturers are going to ship their operation overseas. And as a result, you have jobs moving out of the city of LA even further, okay? And then on top of that, you have the loss of jobs, okay? In the city of LA, lots of African-American teenagers, youth being unemployed. And then to make things even worse, guys, you have the crack epidemic, right? You have the crack epidemic. You have this drug that is really spreading throughout the African-American community. And as a way to somewhat fight against drugs, well, this dates back very early on. This dates back to somewhat Richard Nixon back in the 1970s when you have America having a heroin problem, okay? But crack itself is somewhat a boiled down, cooked down version of somewhat heroin, right? So what you have is that legacy continue. And this is where I mean when we're talking about somewhat the evolution, that slavery didn't really die. Because what you have is slavery was abolished with the 13th Amendment, and then you have it being replaced by Jim Crow, okay? And Jim Crow lasts for about 100 years from the 1890s all the way up until the 1960s. So almost about 3/4 of a century, okay? So you have the evolution of Jim Crow. Now, Jim Crow gets abolished with the Civil Rights Bill in 1964. But that doesn't mean, guys, that African Americans are somewhat completely free. Because what you're going to have is, once again, this idea of law and order, right? You're going to have the criminal justice system making it easier for African Americans to profile, making it easier for African Americans to arrest, and making it easier for prosecutors and judges to ultimately rule with an iron fist when it comes to how they deal with people who commit crimes, people who sell drugs, and who commit violence. We call it the war on drugs. It starts in the 1970s, right? It allowed for more discretion for the police to arrest, profile, right? It allows for prosecutors, judges to hand out heavier sentences. And as a result, you have the mass incarceration of predominantly Black and brown men into the prison system, and it continues up until today. So if you're interested in this topic of mass incarceration and how the war on drugs was basically an extension and a continuation of Jim Crow itself, I really want to recommend it to you. Michelle Alexander's book is called The New Jim Crow. Really recommend it to you. This was a groundbreaking book. I believe it came out in like 2010. This was the book that forever changed how we think about the war on drugs, mass incarceration, and ultimately what's happening today in terms of police brutality. But if you look at it, yes, you have the crack epidemic in the 1980s. And as a result, of course, guys, you're going to have the police, right, performing these dragnet operations. But this thing gets really out of hand because what the Reagan administration is going to do is they are going to allow the police to get access to military equipment, right? So this is where you have the militarization of the police force, right? This is where you have now the police, instead of riding in their little patrol cars, now you have somewhat tanks, you have somewhat armored cars, right? It's really, it really looks like it's a war zone, right? So you have a program to allow law enforcement to have access to armory, weaponry that is used by the military on its own residential civilians. And this is where it's a perfect storm of disaster. Because what you have is you have the crack epidemic inflicting the African-American community, and then you have police, law enforcement being able to somewhat carry out the law with now bigger and bigger guns and somewhat military technology. And as a result, you are going to have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, men of color being arrested, thrown into prison. And by the 1990s, guys, you have the 3-strike law. So by your third offense, you get to go to prison for life, okay? Now, this is where we want to get back to, once again, right? It's a very familiar story. This is the Rodney King beating, right? Similar to the story that I told you about the Watts riot. 1991, you have Rodney King. He's a drunk motorist. He gets pulled over, okay? The police show up, and ultimately they arrest him. He resists arrest, and as a result, they just beat the out of Rodney King. So I will share with you the clip of Rodney King right down below. So if you want to see how they beat this man, you're more than welcome to. But they just beat the out of him, okay? Now, maybe some of you are wondering, well, what's the difference between what they did to African Americans before? The only difference this time is that it was caught on tape, okay? You have people with video, somewhat cameras. I'm not talking about cell phone or anything. I'm talking about video cameras, right? You have somewhat a bystander standing by, and he ends up recording the whole thing on tape. You can clearly see that the police, right, was harassing and just beating the shit out of this man. Now, whether you think that's fair or foul, that's another argument. But you got to look at it from the African-American perspective here, because for decades, this was their experience of the police, right? Dealing law enforcement, policing them with a heavy hand. Now they have armored cars, tanks, bigger guns, bigger weapons. You even have stories of police officers framing African-American suspects, okay? And now you have your smoking gun. You caught the police on tape. That for decades, African-Americans have been arguing that the police have mistreated us. And finally, you have it on tape. And African-Americans are thinking that the fact that they have this evidence, the smoking gun, they're going to get justice for Rodney King. But the problem was, instead of holding the trial in downtown LA, okay, in downtown LA where it happened, the LAPD decided that they're going to make a request that this trial be held not in downtown LA, but in Simi Valley. because you are going to have somewhat the defendant, right? Those who defend the LAPD making an argument that if you hold a trial in LA, potentially you would have Black jurors on the somewhat trial. And since they are Black, they will be somewhat biased, right? They will be partial to Rodney King. And as a result, the LAPD, they can't get a fair trial. That's the argument that they made. So as a result, right, the case moved to Simi Valley, where you have a large white jury. And I think you can already guess here what the verdict was, right? That yes, the 4 police officers, okay, no prison time, no penalty, okay? They made an argument that Rodney King resisted arrest and it was self-defense, okay? So that's the background, guys. And as a result, African Americans, once again, are angry at their economic conditions. They're losing jobs. You got the police raiding their neighborhoods, okay? And then on top of that, the very people that were designed to protect them are now the ones who are killing members in their community. But the good news is, at least Rodney King, he lived to see another day, okay? But once again, 1992, here is where you have, once again, the city of LA burns up in flames, okay? It burns up in flames. Same stories, okay? And this riot, this time, it's even gonna be deadlier than the first time in 1965. 63 people dead, 2,300 people injured. And this was graphic, guys. Like, you can see clips. We just somewhat memorialized the 25-year anniversary of the LA riot in 1992. And it was a brutal riot, but it just seems like, once again, right, African Americans are back at square number one, still finding themselves trapped in the inner cities, finding themselves trapped in unemployment, okay, police brutality, okay, and they are still lagging behind in terms of their white counterpart, okay? And it just seems like the very people who were somewhat assigned to help them, right, it just seems like nothing was making progress. So this is 1992. So here's where I want to fast forward once again. Speaking of anniversaries, last year, 5 years ago, we just celebrated the 50-year anniversary of the Civil Rights Bill in 1964 and 2014. And we also celebrated the Voting Rights Act in 1965 and 2015. So 50 years. Now the question becomes, despite those mechanisms, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Bill, affirmative action, busing programs, the Equal Opportunity Employment Act to allow African Americans to have a fair shake or an opportunity to go find work. If you look at it by all statistical measures, it just seems like African Americans have made very little gains. That Black America since the 1990s, since the 1960s, if you adjust for inflation, okay, it seems like African Americans have made very little gain. Meanwhile, white America made lots of gains. So here I have statistics for you that looks at ultimately the median income between those of whites and also those of Blacks. And you can see that African Americans still somewhat fall behind in terms of their white counterpart, that whites make more money, $67,000 per household, compared to Blacks, $40,000, that African Americans only accounted for 59% of white income, but by 2011, they accounted for 55% of white income. Okay, so that means they actually lost ground then instead of gaining, because you want those numbers to go up, guys, right? But unfortunately, that's not the case. So in terms of median household income, it's the same. In terms of the numbers of African Americans compared that to white living in poverty, it's still the same. That African Americans, 28% compared to white, 10%, still the same. That more African Americans are living under poverty. In terms of net worth, meaning how much stuff do you own? How much money do you own in the bank? How much property do you have? What investment capital do you have? It feels like African Americans on average are still behind those of whites. So if you look at net worth, asset, basically if you look at people's bank accounts, right? Whites, 91,000 compared to African American, 6,000, right, guys? And if you compare the statistics from the 1960s, if you will, it's actually gone backwards, is that it actually has gone down. So in 1984, African Americans somewhat had an increase in 9% in terms of catching up to their white counterpart. And in the 1990s, it was 14%. But in 2011, they're back down to 7% in terms of somewhat catching up to their white counterparts. In terms of net worth and assets, home ownership, compare those to whites from the 1970s up until today's, no change. That 73% of whites own homes, 44% of blacks own homes. That is the disparity, guys, right? If you look at education, you can make an argument that African Americans made a lot of gains in terms of education. So look at the high school completion rate. 1964, only 27% of African Americans completed a high school education. But look at 2012, guys, 86% completion of a high school diploma. Now, maybe some of you are thinking, wow, that's tremendous progress, Professor Nguyen, 27% to 86%. Be careful how you read statistics, guys. That is what I call empty calories. What it means is that even though somewhat you're digesting a lot of calories, right? It doesn't really have an impact. Because if you really think about it, I'll ask you this. How many of you here will go to a party and brag about your high school diploma, right? And think about the type of jobs that you can get with a high school diploma. Nobody brags about a high school diploma, guys. So that's what I mean when it's empty calories. Because yeah, more African Americans are getting a high school education, but what do you do with that? Right? What type of jobs can you get with that? Still, at the end of the day, not much, not much. Okay. Yes. Do high school graduates make more than non-high school graduates? Yes, but they don't make anywhere near to those of college. It's really the college completion rate that you should look at. So if you look at college completion, you can make an argument they made some gains there, right? 4% to 21%, which is good, right? Which is good. But here's the flip side, guys. What's the same? One step forward, two steps back. Okay, so you got more people going to college and getting their college degree. But guys, look at the incarceration rate, right? Look at the incarceration rate. So if you look at the incarceration rate between whites, right? In 1960, out of 100,000 whites, 262 of them went to jail, were in jail, okay? By 2010, that number rose to 676 out of 100,000. So you can make an argument, what? That's a 3-time fold increase, right? 3-time fold increase, okay? Look at the rate for African Americans, right? Much higher, 1,300 in 1960 out of 1,000. But look at the number again, right? For African Americans by 2010, that number rose to 4,300. Okay? But you got to look at the per capita, right? Or per 100,000. Okay? It is still higher than compare those to whites. Okay? So this is what I mean, guys. Statistically, where are the gains? Okay? And this is the reason why it feels like today it is still separated white America from Black America. And a perfect example is this current pandemic itself, how it has impacted certain communities, okay? That you can clearly see that minorities, right? Black and brown is being hit harder because of why their lack to healthcare, right? They're somewhat being uninformed in terms of the information that is floating out there, right? So it's a wide range variety of factors. But what does everybody wants to point to? That despite this analysis, the 50-year anniversary mark, okay, we can clearly see that it's been stagnant. And even if African Americans have made gains in certain areas, they have also been dramatically impacted in other areas as well. But nobody wants to believe it, guys, because why? Oh, we got Barack Obama. Hey, America can't be racist, Professor Nguyen, because we got Barack Obama, right? From 2008 and 2016. Yes, you have Barack Obama during those years, okay? But you still have on a day-to-day basis African Americans being targeted, profiled, okay, arrested. And a perfect example of these inequalities, right? Because I know oftentimes for other students always question, well, why do African Americans always play victim, right? Why can't they just somewhat be like the rest of us, just work hard and ultimately get reward? Here's the difference, guys. So here are the list of activities I want you to think of. Have you ever done any of these things, right? Have you ever somewhat thrown a barbecue at a park? I know I have, okay? Have you ever ate a sandwich on the BART platform? I eat plenty of things. Now, I don't eat a sandwich. I eat a Vietnamese sandwich. I'm Vietnamese, guys, right? Have you ever fell asleep in the studying common area? So if you remember when we were back in school, right? Common areas, right? In building 3, if I'm not mistaken. I see a couple of you guys hanging out there, right? Late night, you're studying. Just happened you fell asleep, right? Because you were studying so hard, okay? Have you ever walked the street at night? Go for a light brisk walk, right? Getting some fresh air, like what we're doing right now. Or maybe you try to be cute back in the day, right? Selling lemonade in front of your neighborhood, right? As a way to somewhat, get the toy that you wanted, right? Have you ever window shop at a department store, right? A high-end department store like Nordstrom, Macy's, or something of that nature, right? This one rented an Airbnb. I know I have, right? I know I have. When I go on vacation, we love Airbnb, okay? Let's see here. Have you ever waited at a Starbucks? Right? Wait at Starbucks, right? You're not buying a coffee. You're just there to meet up a friend, right? You're just there to meet up with an appointment. Somebody from work, maybe you're selling some shit off of Craigslist, right? Have you ever wore a hoodie in public? I love hoodies, right? I got a couple of hoodies myself. All right. What's the other one? Have you ever played Fortnite in your own home with a relative? I don't, but maybe you do. Okay. Okay. Have you ever opened the door, right, to your own home when somebody knocked, right? You hear knocking on the door, you open the door because somebody knocked on your fucking door. That's what we do, guys. We open the door when somebody knocks. Okay. Have you ever been pulled over for maybe a broken taillight? Right? I used to have a lower Honda Civic hatchback. I've been pulled over plenty of times. Tinted windows, your car's too low, your exhaust is too loud, right? Your system is too loud, your speakers is too loud, you're too loud. All jokes aside, have you ever done any of these things? All right, I want you to think about that. And I want you to think about what happened to you after you did any of these things. And the answer, I'm hoping, is that you just went home. Did anybody call the cops on you? Okay. For eating a sandwich on the BART station, for studying in a common area, for sitting at a Starbucks, waiting for an appointment, for playing Fortnite in your own fucking home, right? Or opening the door when somebody knocks on your door, right? Remember, guys, this is before the days of Ring doorbell where you can see people at the door. Did you live to see another day? Okay. Because there are some people that did not. And I'm hoping you recognize some of these images. right? Permit Patty, okay? I'm blanking out on some of the names here, right? So this woman right here I believe this was at Oakland, right? She called the cops because people were having a barbecue out at a park. What else are you supposed to do at a park, right? Renting a Airbnb, right? So all of these were examples of African American, right? Simply a crime for what? For being Black, right? And this is where, if you're not Black, you might want to think about all of those activities. What happened to you after you've done any of those things? Were you arrested? Were you killed? If your answer is no, right? Then I want you to think about the experiences of African Americans today. Because again, it just seems like every step forward is 2 steps back. And even though you have a Black president, that doesn't mean that on a day-to-day basis, these microaggression does not exist. Because why, guys? Historically, we are still dealing with the impact and the legacy of America's original sin, which is slavery. Because let's face it, guys, African Americans publicly, culturally, right, politically, are still viewed with danger. Okay? And that's why people call the cops. And I'm going to share with you another somewhat very graphic, violent clip to give you a sense of what happened to Philando Castillo as he got pulled over by the cops. And I'll let you be the judge of that, okay? But this is where we're at today, guys. So the question becomes, so how do you fix all of this, right? Because unless you like cities burning down every 20, 30 years like they have been. So guys, the question becomes, how do we break this cycle? Okay, how do we break this cycle? It's 50 years, going on 55 years now, and it still feels like we haven't made any progress. That Baltimore burned up in 1968. Here's Baltimore now, 2015, well, 5 years ago, 2015, still the same, right? Still the same. Large Black population, high unemployment rate, okay? Police brutality, right? So how do you break this cycle, guys? How do you allow give African Americans the tools that they need to catch up? That's the dilemma, okay? Because you may think that we are somewhat a diverse society today. Still feel that. I'm not sure if we are. So here's a map or a database that I want you to check out. This was done by the Washington Post as a way to celebrate, again, the 50-year anniversary, right, of the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Bill. And they wanted to see whether or not America has become a more integrated society or not. And what they come to the conclusion is, you can play around with this map if you like. I will share with you down below. You can punch in your area code. It will pull up your city, and it will give you the breakdown of the race of the residents in the area. It's based on census data, guys. This is why the census is so important. So if you play with this database, you can make an argument that the Bay Area is pretty integrated. It's pretty integrated, right? On a somewhat county by county basis. But I can tell you right now, living in San Jose, I don't know if San Jose is as integrated as we think it is. So I don't know how many of you live in San Jose like I do. So I live in Eastside San Jose. And here's where I will wrap up somewhat African Americans and their struggle, and somewhat related to the decision that I had to make. And maybe it will explain to you the complexities in terms of why we haven't solved this problem of segregation. So I told you that my wife and I, we had bought a home back in 2018. And when we were home shopping in 2018, my wife and I had a big dilemma, was that we had a very tight budget. We couldn't really afford certain neighborhoods. So our brother-in-law, who was the real estate agent, he was really frank with us. He was really somewhat honest with us. He says, hi, the only area that you can really afford is either East Side San Jose or South Side San Jose, possibly. So we looked at those areas. So we were somewhat shopping around, and I had a decision to make. There were two homes that I was looking at in two different neighborhoods, okay? One home was located in, I won't say where, but let's just say that I've been informed by a colleague of mine, a friend of mine, that the neighborhood was known as Little Mexico, okay? It's East Side San Jose. And he informed me that, he says, hi, I just want you to know what you're getting into, right? That neighborhood is a little sketch. I said, all right, well, I'm going to go check the home. So I go there, and the house is a bigger house, 3-bedroom. I would have a garage, driveway, nice backyard, bigger house, bigger square foot area. But as I drive there, I noticed that on the streets, there's no damn parking, okay? And I started to notice something funny, that people were parking their cars, not just on the driveway, but also on their lawns. So what that means is that I knew exactly. I was like, okay, there's a lot of immigrants up in here. Okay, there's a lot of immigrants up in here. And I go into this home, and I look at the floor of the garage, and I looked at it. I said, why is it wood? Okay, because typically garages, it's just like pavement, right? And I realized that the owner, he was renting his garage out for people to live in. And I walk in the back, there's a tree house. And I'm not talking about like a cool kid's tree house. I'm talking about like a tool shed, something that you would buy from Home Depot. And basically he built it around a large tree. He was renting that out as well. So I looked around the neighborhood. I was like, oh, wow, bigger house. But my real estate agent, my brother-in-law, he was real with me. He says, hi, if you buy this home, I can't promise you that your home is going to go up in value as fast, because the schools around here are not good. It's crowded parking. It's very crowded late at night. And then on top of that, again, it's Little Mexico, right? So I'm not living among my own here. So I thought about it, and I would get a bigger home at a lower price. And if you think about it, me moving into Little Mexico, I would help integrate America, right? Because I'm Asian, I'm Vietnamese, and I'm moving into what is a predominantly Hispanic, Latinx, somewhat community. So that's what we want, right, guys? We want people of different color, of different culture, living side by side, interacting with one another, socializing with one another, because studies have shown that the more interaction you have with somebody, right, the more likely you will somewhat get along with them, or at least be tolerant of them, or have some kind of understanding. So that was my first option. Bigger home, lower price, integrate America, live in Little Mexico, but parking is kind of tight, okay? Neighborhood, not really somewhat the classic suburban neighborhood, right? Schools are underperformed, let's just put it that way, okay? And also the crime rate is a little higher. Now, here's my alternative. Or I could live in another place. I won't say where, okay? Let's just say that the neighborhood is known as Little Saigon. So for my Vietnamese folks, you know exactly where the hell that's at, okay? In Little Saigon, I could buy a smaller home, okay? But I would have to pay a higher price, okay? So I would get a smaller home, higher price, but I would get a little bit more parking, okay? The schools are a little bit better, okay, in the area. And my brother-in-law informed me that this house has potential, okay? Property value, it has potential. It will go up. I told you the story. We bought our home for $700,000. In a matter of 4 months, my value went up to $900,000. Now it has dipped a little bit since, but still, I have made some gains. I think the last time we assessed our home last year, our home was valued at $800,000. So my real estate agent, my brother-in-law, I trust him. He was correct. Okay. So what is my decision here? Do I live in Little Mexico, have a bigger house, pay a lower price, but risk living in somewhat higher crime area, poor performing schools, right? That my daughter eventually is going to go to, okay? And also no parking, okay? But I would integrate America, okay? But on the flip side, I could live in Little Saigon, be amongst my own people, okay? Pay a little bit higher in price, a smaller home, but my property value will increase. And my daughter will get to go to at least schools that are a little bit higher performing. So what is it gonna be, guys? For me personally, do I choose integration, right? Or do I go and I live amongst my own people, okay? I know, I understand that I'm supposed to be, right? I'm supposed to believe in what I teach, okay? And this is where I'm trying to tell you the complexities to these matter, because we live in a capitalistic society, okay? And every person wants to give his or her children the best opportunities, a better life than they had. And I'm thinking about my daughter, I'm thinking about my family. So what is it gonna be? Do I live in Little Mexico, okay? Have my daughter go to a lower performing school, crowded parking, but I integrate society. I live amongst Hispanic, Latinx folks. And look, guys, I grew up in LA, so you can't tell me that I didn't grow up around somewhat Mexican people. No, right? My best friend was Mexican back in the day, okay? I know them quite well. I got drunk with Mexicans for the very first time, my first time drinking. So don't make it seem like, oh, Professor Nguyen, you're being a racist. No, this is just a matter of, it's about money. Because at the end of the day, every person has a price. Do you integrate society, or do you put your family in the best position to succeed? And this is the reason why, guys, America is still segregated today, like it was 50 years ago. Because you have a system, right? You have a system that is based on accumulation of capital. And at the end of the day, if you dangle in front of me $100,000, $200,000, and my daughter gets to go to a better school, okay, that's what I'm gonna choose. Because at the end of the day, we all wanna give our children a better, somewhat, opportunity than we have. And unfortunately, guys, I don't know what the solution is. Because I know what the solution is, but I don't know if the American capitalist system will be for it. Because at the end of the day, guys, it's a zero-sum game, right? It's about money, okay? It's about money. Because unless you have the government stepping in, subsidizing, and providing assistance, right, to somewhat minorities' neighborhood, right? Unless that happens, things will always be the same. That white America will always be ahead because they started ahead. And even though people of color are behind, right, it's hard to catch up to the other person when they're running as well. And this is the challenging part. And this is why I say home ownership, guys, is so important. Because the fact that African Americans were locked out and excluded from buying homes in the 1950s, it prevented them from accumulating that wealth to pass on to their children. And as a result, that's why they're still somewhat lagging behind. And I think at the end of the day, it comes down to culturally, right? There is still a fear of African Americans. There is still somewhat skepticism towards African Americans. And unfortunately, guys, this is where we're at today, okay? So the question becomes Do you want to let history repeat itself, or do you want to break the cycle? Because what we're seeing is, guys, is that yes, we had Barack Obama from 2008 to 2016, but we also somewhat had Donald Trump. And look, I'm not saying this, but you have scholars, journalists, historians even making an argument that we can read the writing on the wall, that there is a backlash against people of color. Okay? And as a result, right, some people worry that potentially what we're seeing right now is the third redemption. Okay? This is the third redemption because for the last couple of weeks, I have covered the African Americans' experience from the late 1860s all the way up to the present day. Okay? We looked at the rise of Black power after the Civil War in the 1860s. As African Americans got citizenship, they were able to vote, okay, and ultimately participate in the American democracy experiment for the very first time. But what did we see, guys? Violence, terror, white supremacy, right? Making a resurgence by the 1890s. And as a result, some of those gains were lost. You got Jim Crow, right? Poll tax, literacy tests, grandfather clause, right? Convict leasing, sharecropping, okay? All of those mechanisms designed to put African Americans back in their place. That's the first redemption, the 1890s, okay? The second redemption, what do you have? The rise of Black power in the 1960s, Civil Rights Act, right? Voting Rights Bill, 1965, okay? But what do you have? Death of assassination of Martin Luther King, assassination of Malcolm X, okay? And then you have Nixon, Reagan, Bush, Bush 2, Trump, right? The Republican mantra, smaller government, right? Dismantling of affirmative action, dismantling of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, okay? Law and order, right? Mass incarceration, okay? The militarization of the police, okay? And as a result, you have ultimately what is happening going on today, okay? We've seen the cycle, guys, right? Obama, 2008 to 2016, but Baltimore still burns up in flame. So this is why I'm hoping that you can use the history that you have learned as a tool. So that way you can ultimately break the cycle. Whatever that means, guys, okay? I will let you interpret that. But that's what we are on the verge of. So especially for the younger generations out there, Generation Z, and also millennials, myself, right? 2020 is a very important year, and I'm hoping that ultimately you will somewhat cast your vote, okay? And we'll see where the chips fall. But other than that, guys, that somewhat wraps it up here for today. So I hope you check out all the additional information that I have provided down below. The Eyes on the Prize documentary. I hope you check out that clip on the interstate system. And also, if you want to somewhat, if you got nothing else to do, check out somewhat the mapping inequality database, the Washington Post, somewhat segregation map of today. But on that wraps it up for today, guys. So I'm hoping that for the last couple of weeks, you understand the commonalities and the similarities between women's struggle to achieve their rights and also African Americans' struggle for their rights as well. And the key component denominator with both groups, guys, it's about the 14th Amendment, it's about the 15th Amendment. That's what it's about. Citizenship, equal protection, and voting rights, okay? That's what you want to look at, guys, right? Commonalities that both groups have with one another, differences that they have with each other, and make sure you use the documents, right? 6 out of 8 key terms to help you tell a more comprehensive story. But on that, guys, that wraps it up for this video. I hope you have a wonderful week. I know I'm running out of time. I think I got about maybe 3 more lectures to go, okay? For the final stretch of the class, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to look at two movements, the Chicano movement and the Asian American movement in the 1960s. And we're going to look at how ultimately very similar to women and African Americans. We're going to look at how things change for these folks, right? And in their effort to fight for social justice. So I hope that my lectures have been clear in terms of women and African Americans and their quest for equality, to get the promises that were made to them in the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. And I hope you understand the similarities, but also the nuance when it comes to somewhat looking at the experiences of each group. So on that, guys, have a wonderful week, okay? And I will see you next week, right? When we start talking about somewhat Mexican immigration and the Chicano movement itself. But on that, guys, thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next week.